The air was thick with the furnace breath of a Roman summer, heat rising from the cobblestones of the square where a crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder. Soldiers pushed their way through, dragging a man whose calmness seemed almost mocking in the glare of the noon Sunday. At the centre of the gathering stood the instrument of execution, an iron grid already glowing red above a bed of embers. The smell of charcoal mingled with sweat and tension as silence fell, as if the city itself held its breath. Eyes fixed on the condemned, waiting for the inevitable cries, yet none came. Instead, with skin blistering and flesh crackling on the grill, the man looked toward his executioners and spoke words that would echo for centuries. "You can turn me over. This side is already roasted." Who was this man who joked while burning? And what path of faith carried him to this fire? In the dry hills of Hispania, where the Ebro River cuts its restless path through the land, a boy was born around the year 225. His name was Laurentius, known to us now as Lawrence. The town of Huesca, or Huesca as it is called today, was no great city, but its air carried the whispers of Rome and the murmur of a faith still young and fragile. His parents were Christians, a dangerous thing in those years, when devotion to Christ had to be tucked away in houses, taught in whispers, and preserved in the heart. For Lawrence, this hidden faith became the soil of his childhood, shaping his earliest prayers, his earliest sense of purpose. When he was old enough for study, he left the smallness of Huesca for Caesar Augusta, the city we now know as Zaragoza. There he encountered a teacher whose name would mark the course of his life, Sixtus, a man of sharp intellect and quiet holiness. The bond between them deepened quickly, a bond not of convenience but of shared conviction. Lawrence listened as Sixtus spoke of Christ as more than a creed, more than a movement struggling under the Roman boot. To Sixtus, Christ was a fire that burned stronger than fear, and Lawrence let that fire settle into his own spirit. Years passed, and the empire's reach tugged Sixtus toward Rome. It was the eternal city, beating heart of power, arrogance, and splendor, but also a crucible for believers. Lawrence did not hesitate. He followed his mentor across the miles, carrying with him the quiet devotion born in Hispania's soil. In Rome he saw avenues thrumming with soldiers, temples crowned with smoke, senators in their purple-striped togas, beggars crouched at their feet. Here faith did not hide in shadows alone. It breathed in catacombs, whispered in markets, and gathered in clandestine halls. Lawrence's loyalty and diligence soon drew the eye of Sixtus, who by then had risen within the church. It was not long before Lawrence's trust was tested with responsibility. Sixtus appointed him Archdeacon of Rome, a role heavy with both privilege and peril. Lawrence now held the treasury of the church in his care, the alms collected to feed the poor, the chalices and relics used for worship, the sacred vessels guarded like treasure in a city obsessed with wealth. Yet, unlike Roman officials who measured greatness in coin and conquest, Lawrence saw these things as instruments of mercy. Each coin pressed into a widow's palm, each loaf shared with the hungry, each act of quiet generosity became for him the true currency of the kingdom of God. In these years, Rome itself seemed to hover on the edge of fracture. Emperors came and went, each more desperate than the last to clutch at authority. When Valerian ascended to the throne, his first years promised tolerance, even a touch of stability. But the empire was restless, its borders bleeding under barbarian assaults, its economy wheezing beneath taxation and plague. Fear needs a scapegoat, and soon the gaze of the powerful fell upon the Christians. Their refusal to sacrifice to the gods of Rome looked less like piety, and more like rebellion. Their gatherings seemed less like worship, and more like sedition. Lawrence could not have known it, but the shadow of Valerian's hostility was already stretching toward him. For now, he walked the streets of Rome with quiet confidence, distributing alms, guarding the treasures of the church, standing always at the side of Sixtus. Yet even in those moments of peace, the city thrummed with unease. The flames of persecution had been lit before and would be lit again. When would they burn next? Who would they consume? Lawrence, born in a small town of Hispania, educated by a wise teacher, and now keeper of Rome's sacred wealth, was destined to discover the answer sooner than he imagined. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was staggering beneath its own weight. Borders cracked under barbarian pressure, plague drained its cities, and emperors clutched at power as if holding water in their hands. Valerian, who wore the purple in those turbulent years, had little patience for dissent. He needed strength, and if strength could not be found, then it would be manufactured through fear. Christians, with their stubborn refusal to honour the gods of Rome, made the perfect scapegoats. In 257, Valerian issued his first decree. It demanded that bishops, priests and deacons must sacrifice to Jupiter and the other gods or face exile. To the Roman mind, this was simple civic duty. To Christians, it was idolatry. The order carried across the empire, striking at the heart of the faith's leaders. For a brief time, some hoped exile might be the worst of it. But a year later, the second blow came. In 258, Valerian's new edict left no room for compromise. The penalty for defiance was death, swift and certain. The catacombs of Rome, once a refuge of silence and prayer, became theatres of blood. It was there, on the 6th of August, that soldiers stormed into the shadows and seized Pope Sixtus II along with 4 deacons. The faithful gathered helplessly, their cries echoing through tunnels carved by generations of the dead. Lawrence, the Archdeacon, reached for his mentor with a desperation that tore at the heart. "Where are you going, Father, without your son?" His voice cracked, not only with grief but with the weight of impending fate. Sixtus, bound yet unbroken, looked at him with eyes steady as stone. "I merely precede you. In 3 days, you will follow me." The words fell heavy, not as a threat but as a promise. Lawrence knew then that his days were numbered, measured not in years but in hours. Yet even in that shadowed place, something deeper stirred a resolve that made fear seem pale. When the soldiers dragged Sixtus and the deacons out into the daylight, their deaths were swift. Swords flashed, prayers rose, and blood stained the earth. Rome thought it had silenced another voice. But the prefect, hungry for more than blood, turned his eyes toward Lawrence. As archdeacon, he was keeper of the church's wealth. Surely the coffers of Christians, whispered about in every market and tavern, held riches enough to please an emperor. The prefect's demand was simple and cruel. Within 3 days, Lawrence must deliver the treasures of the church into Roman hands. Failure would mean death. The ultimatum spread like fire through the community. 3 days. 3 days to choose between surrender and defiance, between life and faith. To the prefect, it was a game of power. To Lawrence, it was the sharpening point of destiny. The city braced in silence. Somewhere beneath its arches and markets, a man who had once been a boy from Hispania prepared to face not only Rome's fury but the judgment of eternity. The prefect expected gold. He expected silver, jewelled chalices, perhaps even hidden vaults where the Christians stored their forbidden wealth. What he did not expect was a man who saw treasure with different eyes. Lawrence left the tribunal with 3 days granted to him. 3 days that for most would have been filled with dread and frantic schemes of escape. But Lawrence's path was already clear. He walked the alleys of Rome not in fear but in purpose, carrying with him coins, sacred vessels, and whatever resources the church held. These he placed into hands that trembled with hunger, into palms worn by labour, into the arms of widows and children. The sick were clothed, the lame fed, the blind embraced. In those 3 days, the archdeacon turned Rome's wealth into mercy, scattering what the empire coveted into the very lives it despised. When the deadline arrived, soldiers dragged him back before the prefect. Torches cast long shadows against the tribunal walls. The prefect leaned forward, impatient, certain that vaults heavy with treasure were about to be laid at his feet. But Lawrence, with calm eyes and an unflinching voice, gestured for the doors to open. In shuffled the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lepers, the orphans. Faces marked by suffering, bodies bent by need. Souls cast aside by Roman pride. They filled the chamber until the marble floor seemed too small to contain them. Lawrence stretched out his hands toward them and declared, "Behold, these are the treasures of the church." A gasp ran through the hall, half amusement, half outrage. For a moment it seemed almost a jest too bold to be believed. But the prefect's face darkened with fury. He had been mocked, deceived, humiliated in front of his own guards. "Do you dare," the prefect spat, "to play games with the authority of Rome?" Lawrence did not flinch. He met the gaze of power with serenity that seemed almost otherworldly. "The church is truly rich," he replied. "These poor are our gold, these sick our silver. In them, Christ is reflected more brightly than in any jewel." The prefect's rage needed no further fuel. He ordered that Lawrence be tortured until he revealed the whereabouts of the riches he surely must have hidden. Wealth, he thought, could not vanish so quickly. Pain would extract its truth. But Lawrence had already revealed everything. His truth was not buried in coffers but living in the faces of the poor, and no chain, no flame, no iron could strip that truth away. So, the order was given. Not a swift execution, but something crueler. An instrument of death was prepared, designed not for mercy but for spectacle. An iron griddle would be heated until it glowed, and on it the deacon would be laid like meat on a feast day fire. His body would cook slowly, agony prolonged, his cries rising for the entertainment of the crowd. Yet even as the prefect plotted, a strange anticipation hung in the air. For Lawrence, the moment of greatest trial was approaching, and though the empire sharpened its cruelty, it could not imagine what kind of defiance would rise from the flames. Night fell heavy over Rome, but the square blazed with firelight. At its centre stood the cruel Devician iron griddle, broad and merciless, laid across a bed of glowing embers. The smell of smoke drifted upward, mingling with the murmurs of a restless crowd. People pressed close, eager for spectacle, their faces lit by orange flame. Soldiers shoved a man forward, binding him with cords that cut into his flesh. Lawrence, Archdeacon of Rome, did not resist. His gaze remained calm, almost tender, as if he were walking into prayer rather than torture. The heat pulsed outward, wrapping him in waves before his body even touched the iron. When the soldiers lowered him, the searing pain erupted instantly. Flesh sizzled, the sound was sickening, a hiss like meat roasting at a banquet. The stench of burning skin clawed at the nostrils of those nearest the fire. The crowd braced for screams, for the howling agony that always followed such torment. But silence reigned. Lawrence's lips moved, not in curses but in prayer. His face, illuminated by the flames, seemed to radiate an impossible peace. Whispers spread among the onlookers, was it madness? Or was it something divine? The prefect watched with narrowed eyes, anger growing sharper with every moment that his victim refused to entertain him with despair. Minutes dragged like hours. The griddle seared one side of his body black, and still he endured. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, Lawrence lifted his head. His voice carried across the square, steady and edged with irony. "You can turn me over. This side is already roasted." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Some laughed nervously, others crossed themselves in awe. The prefect's fury boiled, yet even he could not silence the echo of those words. The joke, absurd and defiant, rang louder than any cry of pain could have. Ancient accounts speak of strange signs that followed. Some claimed his face shone with light, unscarred by the flames. Others swore a fragrance rose from the fire, not the stench of death but the sweetness of incense. A few even whispered that soldiers watching turned their hearts to the faith that Rome tried so hard to extinguish. Skeptics, of course, would later argue that no man could survive such torment long enough to speak, that perhaps he was beheaded instead, and the grill was a legend woven afterward. Yet the story endured because it captured something deeper than fact. Whether roasted on iron or cut by sword, Lawrence's defiance became a flame no executioner could smother. When at last his body gave way, silence hung heavy. The prefect had achieved his vengeance, but not his victory. For even in death, the deacon had mocked Rome's power and revealed a treasure beyond its reach. And as his ashes cooled on the embers, the true weight of his witness began to spread sparks carried not by fire, but by memory. When the flames of Rome finally dimmed and the body of Lawrence was carried away, the story of his death had only begun to burn. The faithful gathered his remains in secret, laying him to rest along the Via Tiburtina, a road that wound like a scar through the empire's heart. There, in the hush of the catacombs, prayers rose over his tomb. What had been meant as humiliation became a seed, planted in earth watered with blood. Within decades, the grave of Lawrence became a destination of reverence. Pilgrims whispered his name in the dark tunnels. Mothers brought their children to touch the stone. Soldiers laid aside swords to kneel in silence. In time, Constantine, the first Christian emperor, raised a basilica over that hallowed ground, lifting Lawrence's memory into the sunlit air of history. The eternal city, once his place of torment, became the shrine of his honour. But his legacy did not remain confined to Rome. Across the waters, in his native Spain, devotion to the roasted martyr grew fierce. Centuries later, King Philip II of Spain would commission El Escorial, a vast monastery and palace whose very floor plan was shaped like a grill, in homage to Lawrence's final trial. The building's granite walls stood as a monument to irony, an empire of stone built upon the memory of a man who mocked an empire with a joke while burning alive. Artists seized his story as a canvas for faith. Fra Angelico painted Lawrence with serene beauty. Titian captured the heat of his martyrdom. Rubens gave him muscular defiance. Each brushstroke turned suffering into glory, agony into art. Poets sang of him too Prudentius, weaving hymns that mingled fire and triumph. Augustine declaring that the flames outside Lawrence could never match the fire of love within him. Theirs was not the voice of pity, but of victory, proclaiming that Rome's cruelty had birthed not defeat, but immortality. Even language bent toward him. Laurentius, his name, linked to the laurel crown of victory. Over time, he became patron of the poor whom he had served, of librarians who guarded knowledge as he once guarded the church's treasures, and ironically of cooks, whose grills bore faint resemblance to his martyrdom. Where Rome had meant to reduce him to ashes, the world instead raised him as protector and companion in all the strange corners of life. Nature itself seemed to echo his story. Every August, when the Perseid meteor shower streaks the sky with burning trails, people across Europe called them the Tears of St. Lawrence. To believers, the heavens themselves became his theatre, the stars flickering embers of the grill that once held him. Fire had not destroyed him, it had been scattered across the night sky, eternal and uncontainable. His legacy, in the end, asked a question larger than Rome's cruelty, larger even than the Church's triumph. What is treasure? Is it gold that rusts, jewels that fade, power that slips like sand through desperate hands? Or is it the poor lifted from dust, the laughter that outlasts pain, the courage that smiles while flesh burns? Lawrence's answer was carved not in words alone, but in the posture of his life, in the serenity of his death. And so his story endures, not as a tale of defeat, but of transformation. The prefect who sought wealth found instead a mirror of his own emptiness. The empire that sought silence found itself haunted by laughter that rang from the flames. The man who should have been forgotten became a saint whose smile still lights the centuries. Even now, if you look up on a summer night and see a streak of fire across the sky, you might imagine it is Lawrence still speaking, still joking, still pointing beyond the power of Rome to the greater fire that burns without consuming. His body perished, but his irony, his courage, his joy under torment remain. And perhaps that is the truest treasure of a lone man's laughter, carried through the smoke of execution, still reminding us that meaning can be found even at the edge of agony.